I reported abuse in family law court and I lost custody to the abuser.
He threatened to kill me if I ever talked about the abuse.
Did you molest your son?
California's family courts under a microscope amid concerns that judges are granting custody to abusers. One boy says he had no choice but to ignore a court order and go on the run. In tonight's special edition of True Crime Stories. Good evening, everyone. I'm Gina Silva. Tonight, a look at kids lost in the system and the family courts that critics say ignore both the law and common sense in awarding custody to parents accused of abusing their own children. Now, recently, some moms staged a protest outside of a San Diego courthouse.
We reported abuse and I lost my grandchild.
I reported abuse and lost my son.
I reported abuse and lost custody to the abuser.
Mostly it boils down to money and power and reputations. They don't want to ruin the reputation of a otherwise nice guy, and it's much easier to say that a woman is alienating or coaching her child to say they're abused.
What do we want?
Children protected.
When do we want it?
Now!
Here are some statistics that tell you more about the problem. The American Judges Association says parents who battered or physically abused their spouses got sole or shared custody in about 70% of the cases. Another smaller study shows more or less the same thing with parents accused of sexually abusing their kids. They got custody or unsupervised visitation 85% of the time. Now, joining us to help figure out why so many kids are lost in the system is Robin Sachs. Are those figures correct?
These figures are correct, and they are frighteningly true. And story after story, case after case, we're going to hear about just two of them. But since we've started covering these stories, my phone's been ringing off the hook. My email box is full. And despite conventional wisdom, where people actually think that moms are the ones favored to get custody in the system, it's untrue. The system right now are favoring abusers.
Well, it seems to have gone completely on the opposite side.
It has. I mean, I think that what happened is that there was like a corrective foul, if you will, just like it is in basketball, where, oh, okay, for all the years that moms were deferred and where the protocol was mom gets custody, all of a sudden judges are making up for that historic happening and now deciding, you know what, in a situation where we can't figure out what happened, or a situation where we don't have the resources to figure out what happened, or in the situation where we don't know what happened, we're going to give custody to the dad as the default.
All right, we're going to talk more about that. Now, one of the cases that we've been following here on Fox 11 is Damon's case. We've done several stories about him. Damon is now in hiding from his father, who was given full custody by a judge. Damon has been all over the internet accusing his dad of abuse.
This is Damon, and I was just making this video because I want you to know how my dad sexually abused me.
Did you molest your son? Did you touch him inappropriately? Did you have sex with him?
No. God, no. Absolutely not.
It's not a he says, she says scenario. There's evidence that shows that what I'm saying is correct.
Now, you had a chance to interview Damon, and we did the story, and I've had a lot of folks call me and ask me, they're not sure if they believe him. They're not sure if maybe mom did coach him. What do you say to all of that?
Well, you know, first of all, I have two comments. First of all, there's a lot of people out there who want to know what happened. At this point today, as Damon sits here right now, I have to say, you have a kid who believes, absolutely believes that he has been abused and has taken to the streets, is on the run. As a father, why is it that that dad still is fighting for abuse? And the behavior of the dad seeking to exercise control, threatening deprogramming camp, doing all of those things seem to me to corroborate Damon's words. That's besides the interview that I saw of Damon at the time. There were many, many telltale signs of truth from the forensic interview that actually occurred, the documentation over time. But even if we put all of that aside, you have a kid who can talk, a kid who was interviewed, and a kid who is saying what he wants, and this system does not listen to the children.
All right, well, we're going to have more on that in a minute. But first, a young woman who went through a similar ordeal. She lives in New Zealand now, but as a child, she lived in Northern California. She also had to fight the courts that granted custody to her father, a well-connected attorney, a man she says physically abused her. Now, 12 years ago, when Alana Cross was 16, she wrote an article that said, "The lawyer appointed to represent my best interests ignored my reports of abuse. The therapist my father made me see was sleeping with him. The judge, an admitted long-term friend, rubber-stamped any order my father requested." At one point, Alana was sent to an institution for deprogramming. She talked to Liz Habib about her ordeal.
You felt like no one was listening to you in all of this.
In the system, the way that it's set up, I had absolutely no voice in my own case. In this case, that was really deciding the fate of my whole life. And unfortunately, the people who were supposed to be standing up for me really failed to do that. And in the end, I was placed with my abusive father, and that was the outcome.
So your father claimed that you had been, in effect, brainwashed by your mother to not like him, and so he sent you away to camp. Tell us about that.
They said that I was delusional, that I had made up the abuse stories about my father, that I had been brainwashed by my mother. So I got into this really interesting dynamic where they were saying I had been brainwashed, and my challenge was to convince them that I believed them while still holding on to the truth, because I realized very quickly that I was getting nowhere telling the truth with these people. They knew who was paying their bills, which was my father. And so I had to, during the day, convince them that I believed what they were saying, and at night I remember just going over in my head, okay, I know what's true, my mother loves me, my father abused me, you know, hold on to what's real in this world, and it was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. No child gets up and says, I do not want to see my parent, I am terrified of my parent, unless there's a really good reason.
And for a long time there, you just lived moving from place to place to place, basically hiding, didn't you?
That's right. So I made it to Los Angeles. I looked up a very distant relative. You know, I couldn't contact my mother because my father had sent, you know, investigators to her house and was convinced that she was behind my running away, but really it was me. So after that, I was passed from sort of safe house to safe house until finally I hooked up with a family who said that I could stay longer term, which was great, and I decided I needed to turn myself into social services in Los Angeles, and luckily Los Angeles Juvenile Court took jurisdiction of my case, and I truly believe they saved my life.
What a story. Now, Alana had a message for Damon, and she said, "We're pulling for you." You know, why is it that they're not listening to these kids?
Well, and that's what's so ironic. I mean, look at this story. This is Alana speaking now. She's 26 years old. She's talking in her own words. What's ending up happening to these children is they're ending up with no parent. They are forced to take care of themselves. They have to hit the street. They're missing out on educational opportunities. And as a parent, I'm a mom. I'm sitting here thinking, you know what? At some point, you have to say, I need to do what's best for my child. And sometimes what may be best for my child may be listening to what they're actually saying. And that's my message to these abusers out there, or to the ones who even think that they're falsely being abused. If you have any care for your kid, you wouldn't want them in this situation.
All right, thank you, Robin. Well, Alana eventually won her case, but what about Damon? He can't go to school this fall because he's in hiding. His dad has offered to give him legal emancipation, but Damon is afraid it's a trick and he'll be sent to a deprogramming camp himself.
You found out through court documents, actually, that your dad had an intention to send you to some sort of deprogramming camp. He says that he was going to actually send you to a tennis camp.
He tried to send me to a deprogramming camp where they are known for using methods that you can't even use on prisoners of war to get kids to recant the abuse.
He says there's really only one way out for him, and that's emancipation, that you won't come out of hiding to do the emancipation.
Even if my dad and my mom both give consent forms, and even if the DA lends support, the judge could still say, no, you have to go back with your father.
So he has absolutely no trust for the prosecutors or for anybody involved, or his dad.
Well, Damon is in a conundrum, and equally in conundrums are a lot of times parents who believe that their kid is being abused, and they're faced with asking themselves the question, well, if this is what's going on in the courts, I want to tell someone, but if I tell someone, I may be faced with losing custody of my kid. And then
you advised your clients not to say something.
Right. There have been cases where I had a case of a 3-year-old where there was no proof, It was going to be touching. You weren't going to have proof, by the way. It was an over-the-clothes touching where there wouldn't have been DNA. No one sexually assaults people where there's eyewitnesses. Many people don't confess to these types of things. And I actually had to advise my client and say, listen, you could end up losing custody by telling the courts. And then the great irony is that if it's determined at some other point that there was abuse, that same person who was in fear of losing custody could also be charged with fail to protect. So you're
punished either way.
Either way.
It makes no sense. All right, Robin. Well, coming up next on True Crime Stories, Robin talks to a judge who's trying to change things.
I believe that transparency is important for this system so the public will have a better understanding of what works.